High-stakes negotiations in Kyiv between the U.S. and Ukraine's president. What will come of those talks and how far away are reinforcements? Orthodox Easter with no peace on earth for Ukrainians. 4 possible endings to the war and the trauma for children enduring Russia's assault. Now, on the Inside Story, Ukraine negotiating war.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Pursuti, VOA Senior Washington TV Correspondent. We're here today at the Ukrainian Embassy in the busy DC Georgetown neighborhood. 8 weeks ago when we were here, this area was brimming with tons of flowers and notes and posters of solidarity. Still some left behind today, especially the famous sunflower. This is the national flower of Ukraine, now known more as the international symbol of peace. But you know, the lack of mementos left behind now, we're reminded that this war may take some time to end. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to take you inside the next phase of the war and look at various scenarios for its end. First, though, a return to normalcy, at least diplomatically. American diplomats are gradually returning to their posts in Ukraine after the U.S. Secretaries of Defense and State visited Kyiv and met with Ukraine's president. Details from VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell.
Guns or diplomacy? Why not both? That's what 2 of President Joe Biden's top cabinet members offered Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the highest-profile U.S. visit to Kyiv since the war began in late February. Ahead of the Sunday visit, Zelensky warned the officials to not show up empty-handed. They didn't. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced $713 million in military financing for Ukraine and 15 allied and partner countries. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. would reopen its shuttered Kyiv embassy. Biden on Monday announced a nominee for ambassador, who now faces congressional approval.
Today in Kyiv, at such a crucial, important moment for our state, I'm very thankful that the United States of America is really helping Ukraine. I would also like to thank President Biden personally for his personal support of Ukraine.
Blinken said the visit came at a key junction in this conflict, now in its 8th week.
This was, in our judgment, an important moment to be there, an important moment for Ukraine, for the war, an important moment to have face-to-face conversations in detail about the extraordinary support that we provided, security, economic, humanitarian, as well as the massive pressure that we've been exerting on Russia, and then to talk in detail about how we carry that forward across all of those fronts.
But analysts say this visit lags behind those of other European leaders.
Some other European countries have already moved their embassy back to Kiev. In an ideal world, you would want to see America, at the forefront of these efforts, not being the first embassy to leave Ukraine, as it did before the conflict, and being among the last to return.
Other analysts say the diplomatic announcement was crucial.
Even on a short-term basis, sending diplomats on overnight missions to overnight trips to Lviv to staff up a consulate there, that's a real tremendous show of support to the Ukrainian government, to the Ukrainian people, that the U.S. commitment is still there.
The White House said Monday that the assistance would continue, but might vary as the conflict progresses.
In terms of what the next package will look like and what will be passed, those are discussions and recommendations that the president will get from his military leaders. We'll have those discussions with Congress. I'm not in a position to put a cap on it at this point in time.
But when will it end? That's not clear, but Zelensky's parting plea to the Americans was. The U.S., he said, needs to be a leader among the future guarantors of our country's security. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
April 24th, on the 2-month anniversary of Russia's invasion, Orthodox Christians across Ukraine gathered to celebrate Easter. As you'll see in this next video, a celebration of a resurrection is a stark contrast to the nation's rising death toll and destruction. The significance of this day offered peace and hope to the religious community. VOA's Heather Murdoch reports from Irpin and Kharkiv.
On Sunday, Easter for Orthodox Christians, the religion of most Ukrainians, fell on the same day that marks 2 months of war in Ukraine. Kyiv, Ukraine's second city, has been bombarded with missiles and other heavy weaponry almost every day since the conflict began. But many people in Kyiv braved the streets to attend services for Easter, one of the nation's most beloved holidays.
I'm human, but of course I felt fear like an animal. But I'm also religious and rely on God. I believe He will protect us.
In the suburbs of the capital, Kyiv, services were even more sparse. Many towns and villages remain nearly abandoned, even though Russia has refocused its efforts in eastern Ukraine. This town, Irpin, was the site of gruesome battles. The next town over is Bucha, where Ukraine accuses Russian soldiers of committing war crimes, including the murder of civilians and mass rape while occupying the town. Families here are celebrating with caution, saying they believe war will return to their areas.
I didn't think we'd make it home by Easter. We left on the second day of the war, and the Russians were close, surrounding the city. We then followed the news and knew the situation was serious.
And in Kyiv, families say they fear attacks on their city and others under siege will continue to get worse before they get better.
It's terrifying. I hope God protects everyone from these events. I wouldn't wish for anyone to go through this. It's a nightmare.
Heather Murdoch, VOA News, Irpin, Ukraine.
Russia's ambassador in Washington sent a formal diplomatic note to the U.S., warning that large deliveries of weapons to Ukraine is inflaming the conflict. It came a day after Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the U.S. wants to weaken Russia's military capabilities. And a senior State Department official tells our Nike Ching that Russia's attempt to take away Ukraine's independence is, quote, not going to happen, predicting some kind of negotiation to end the war. So how will this war end? Here are 4 possible ways.
A look at 4 ways the war in Ukraine could end. Russian win. Ahead of Russia's invasion, many Western intelligence assessments predicted a quick Russian victory. That did not happen. Ukraine mounted a strong initial response with highly motivated fighters and weapons from countries around the world. For Russia to win now, it must follow a more difficult path. Russian troops have attempted to capture major Ukrainian cities, but struggled after finding them already heavily fortified. As a result, Moscow shifted its strategy to focus on Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, where pro-Russian rebels have been waging a separatist rebellion.
If the Russians try to make a big push to surround the Donbass, that could be very difficult for Ukrainian forces to keep fighting in the way that they have been fighting. And it could make things difficult for resupply efforts by the US, NATO, and other allies as well.
If Russia were to try to capture major Ukrainian cities again, including the capital, Kyiv, it would mean using ever more powerful strategies, including airstrikes. This would result in more civilian casualties. Russia has significantly more troops than Ukraine, as well as more weapons, giving it a large military advantage. Ukraine prevails. For Ukraine to prevail on the battlefield, it would need to earn victories against a much stronger Russian force. Military analysts say that to hold the capital, Ukraine might have to give up smaller cities. Ukrainian forces could continue to mount armed ambushes and attack Russian support lines, hoping to force a stalemate that leads to a Russian withdrawal.
And what Russia is doing so far is not really a pullback that shows that Russian forces are going to go home, back to Russia. In fact, what the US suspects is that the Russians are clearly just repositioning and regrouping, refueling, resupplying, and getting ready to go and attack Ukraine some more.
More likely, Ukraine could prevail through the combination of military successes and worldwide pressure on Russia. Russia is suffering from both economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation. The war could end with a diplomatic solution, especially if Russian ally China exerts strong pressure on Moscow. Another way Ukraine could prevail, a remote possibility, is if Russian President Vladimir Putin were removed from office. This would likely require ordinary Russians to revolt against the war or elites to carry out a coup. Protracted quagmire. Even if Russia could capture Ukraine's major cities, an easy victory would not be assured. Ukrainian fighters could engage in a drawn-out insurgency that would last months or even years. Insurgents could dig deep into cities and hide on rooftops, in alleyways, and inside buildings. A well-coordinated force, armed with weapons from the West, could hold off a large assault for a long time. This could result in a stalemate. Such a conflict could lead to mounting casualties on both sides and wear away Russian resolve. This outcome would mirror Russia's fight in Afghanistan in the 1980s. It is not clear what Putin's goal is for Ukraine. If he wants to install a pro-Russian government, he would likely need a Russian occupation to support it. Such an occupation could also face prolonged armed resistance and lead to a protracted quagmire. Wider war. The worst-case scenario would be an expanded war that brings in other European countries. Such a war could involve several nuclear-armed countries. It could escalate quickly and lead to catastrophic outcomes. For these reasons, European countries, the United States, and NATO have been careful to try to keep the conflict from escalating. They made clear they were not in a war with Russia and ruled out sending troops. They also rejected the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine because it could lead to the downing of Russian planes. A wider war could still be unintentionally triggered by a series of missteps. It is also possible that Russia could intentionally escalate the conflict if, for example, it was facing defeat.
Let's go a little deeper to explain what might happen and why. Michael OHanlon is a senior fellow and director of research for foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Now that Russia appears to be focusing on the Donbass region in southeastern Ukraine, here's how OHanlon thinks the war might end.
One of them is the Russians keep underperforming, and the fact that they seem to be in a hurry to achieve results by May 9th, Victory in Europe Day, increases the odds that could happen because the fields in eastern Ukraine are, as I understand it, not suitable for wide-scale vehicle movement right now. They're too muddy, and so the Russians are constrained to the roads. The roads may not be quite as conducive to hit-and-run guerrilla tactics by Ukrainians wielding anti-tank weapons as they were around Kyiv a couple months ago, but I still think there's a chance the Russians could just wind up being largely stymied. So that's scenario one. Scenario two is that I'm wrong about some of that tactical engagement. The Russians correct a few of their mistakes and maybe slow it down so they have better weather and firmer ground beneath them when they do go on the attack. Or maybe just the overall mass effect of having so many more vehicles than Ukraine ultimately pays dividends, and they make at least some progress in the Donbass and ultimately do create some version of this infamous land corridor. And then maybe they create those facts on the ground, frozen conflict, if you will, make that the sort of new starting point territorially for any ceasefire talks, and maybe call it a day at that point. Scenario three builds on scenario two, and there may be, an intervening period of relative peace before Russia then opens up the attack again with the goal of ultimately getting to Kyiv. And maybe it's the summer of 2023 when it happens. I don't know. I have a hard time figuring out how to expedite an end to the war. I think One important distinction is going to be between a ceasefire and a lasting peace. And the ceasefire probably needs to include some sanctions relief on Russia to give it incentive, but it probably cannot resolve the long-term territorial dispute, because I think this peace deal that I'm envisioning would only happen once Russia did have Mariupol firmly in its grasp and some greater part of the Donbass that created that land bridge, which means that it's not going to be considered legitimate or acceptable in Ukrainian eyes. The only way in which Russia could ever wind up with that territory de jure, as opposed to just de facto, would be if the passage of time changed people's views on what they could live with. And in the short term, I would think Ukrainians would see any Russian acquisition of Ukrainian land as fundamentally unacceptable and a further insult on top of all the killing and all the bombardment and brutality. And so it's hard for me to see President Zelensky or anybody else realistically accepting that. But maybe if you think of it more in terms of a ceasefire, that you don't need anybody to codify the territorial issue or the territorial reapportionment, but you simply accept that Russian forces are in certain places, Ukrainian forces are in other places. Maybe you even deploy some monitors between them, and then you just put that part of the dispute off to the side. Then you try to actually get agreement on the other issues where I think they're mostly more realistic to imagine agreement. For example, Ukraine will not be in NATO, but it will have enhancements to its security based on NATO and EU promises to restore sanctions if Russian attacks, recommence, and also that Ukraine will continue to build up its armed forces and be allowed to do that. But Ukraine will not join NATO. It will have, again, some kind of a permanent neutrality with security enhancements, and possibly a long-term deployment of some kind of a peace monitoring force that would not be the usual UN peacekeeping force subject to annual review, but that would have a 15-year mandate and 15-year funding stream already assured, so that Russia would not be able to monkey around with the mandate or the funding in the future. And the 15 years would be designed to outlast Putin. And so those are the kind of pieces to a peace plan that I would envision being considered. Of course, right now there aren't really any meaningful talks happening, but those are the pieces. But the territorial one is the hardest. And so I think that one you have to find some way to essentially put off to the side or punt or delay or finesse.
One of the results of Russia's war on Ukraine may soon be a bigger NATO. Sweden and Finland are reportedly set to submit membership applications to NATO next month. Now, both countries cooperate with NATO, but had not yet pursued full membership to avoid provoking Russia. Adding the two countries would lengthen NATO's boundary with Russia and also help protect the Baltic states that border Russia. On the ground, Ukraine is getting help from the U.S. and other nations. Volunteers are offering to help fight the war in Ukraine. Our Nina Vishneva has that story.
Andrew Bennett divides his time between his carpenter job and preparing to leave for Ukraine. Late evenings are the only time he can take a minute to himself.
President Zelensky is an amazing leader. He is a faithful leader. He's an inspiring leader. He's the bravest man on the planet at this time.
In just a few days, Bennett is scheduled to leave for Poland. From there, he'll head to Ukraine, where he plans to help defend the country against Russia.
I'm going to pick up my ballistic helmet next week. I've got the plates. I've got the plate carrier.
Andrew's never been to Ukraine before, but he's determined to help its people fight for their freedom. He's trying to join the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine, and he's not alone. There are thousands of foreigners, just like Bennett. According to the Ukrainian authorities, more than 20,000 foreigners have already joined the International Legion of Territorial Defense. So far, just over 100 applications from American citizens have been approved, out of more than 6,000. Anthony Capone is an IT specialist offering financial support to those who help protect Ukraine as members of the International Legion of Territorial Defense.
Many of the people who said, oh, I wish I could join the Foreign Legion, I just can't afford to get over there. I can't afford the flight. I don't know how to get the transport. I don't know how to do my application. I don't have a passport. I don't have, gear. And I said, okay, well, that's something, I could help with.
Capone is in Poland with a team of 10 people who help with documentation and logistics. He notes the volunteers do not get paid. Instead, he says, the financial support goes toward the purchase of ammunition and to cover transportation costs.
There was a time where I got a little bit overwhelmed when we first started because I thought I would have 10 to 15. And then there was, I started this when I was on a flight. And by the time I got off the flight, it was a 7-hour flight. I had already had 170 applicants.
Capone created a special website for foreign volunteers in order to run a check on volunteers and coordinate them with potential sponsors. He's also making sure that there are no acting military among the volunteers. On this day, he has applications from 36 countries. Besides the US and countries in Europe, there are applications from Colombia, Chile, South Korea, Morocco, and New Zealand. The US government has urged Americans to avoid traveling to Ukraine, but this is not stopping Bennett. In addition to military gear, he is taking a satellite phone, his iPad with Ukrainian language lessons, and his Bible. The carpenter also hopes to one day use his skills to literally help rebuild Ukraine after the war comes to an end. Fanina Vishneva in New York, Anna Rice, VOA News.
At least 1.5 million children are among the nearly 5 million Ukrainians who have fled the country since Russia's attack began. Experts are now studying the impact of the war on Ukraine's youth and what that might mean for the next generation. VOA's Celia Mendoza goes inside a refugee center in Przemyśl, Poland.
Innocent Ukrainian children play in refugee centers far from home. At a tender age, they have heard and felt the sounds of a war they can't yet understand.
I heard a lot of explosions. It was difficult to go by train. We heard sirens and problems. I am very scared. I want to tell everyone that it's better to stay at home or go to the basement.
Uprooted from their homes, these children feel safe in Poland. Young Maxim, who is from Odessa, is aware of why they had to flee.
On February 24th, I heard 3 explosions and we had an air alarm, and then the normal one. After a week, 2 or 3, they started bombing again. It's been about 3 days. 2, I don't know. Then we all stocked up on food and water.
As children arrive at the Polish border, some are carrying emotional scars over what they have seen and lived through.
In some places, they fire a lot of rockets. The planes flew over us. In our region, they shot down a plane and everything. And in the other regions, tanks were coming. They were shelling buildings.
While it might be difficult for younger children to express themselves, some wishfully share their loss.
I left a cat in Ukraine. Also, my grandparents stay there. I went to music school, played basketball. I can play the piano. I am talented.
Some look forward to a new future in another country. Others yearn to return home.
I want to go back home. That's where my cat Vishinka and my dogs are. They miss me there. But our path turned out to be very difficult.
Seemingly wise beyond his years, Maxim has developed a sense of patriotism caused by the Russian invasion.
I want to be a military man because I want to protect our land.
The destruction and ordeal that children like Maxim have endured, along with their parents, are likely to shape their lives forever. Celia Mendoza, VOA News, Przemyśl, Poland.
That's all for now. For all of us behind the scenes who brought you today's show, I'm Carolyn Pursuti. Follow me on Twitter at CarolynVOA and connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News. Stay up to date online 24/7 at voanews.com. We'll see you next week for another version of The Inside Story.